Hi, I'm Wayne Tuttle, and this is Chasing Legends. Welcome back. This is Chasing Legends. I'll be your host, Wayne Tuttle. Kind of obvious I say that, and then I come back and it's still me. Anyhow, go down, please hit subscribe, hit the notifications bell to find out what we're doing when new videos are coming out every Monday afternoon on a weekly basis. Pick up the shirts. Go to our About section. You'll see the shirts for Dutch Hunter Rendezvous, Legend of the Superstition Mountains, black and gray, short sleeve, long sleeve. And leave a comment if you like. I think we're gonna get a lot of comments this week. So as I promised, we're going to start to delve down the rabbit hole of the stone maps. Now I said I'll split these things up. There was the stone maps, Peralta stone maps, Jesuit stone maps, Peralta stones, however you want to call it. And then there's the Latin heart, and then there's the bilberry crosses as we know them, or stone crosses or whatever. And I'm going to split those all up into three different things because they were supposedly discovered by three different people, and they kind of tie in together, and I think the museum actually lumps them together, but they deserve some separation. And they have very separate stories. So we're going to begin, because why not take on the biggest one of them all? I'm not drinking tonight. I should, because that would help me through this, but I will do this. Now, what we're going to do is I'm going to do the documented of everything documented from books, interviews, and people have been there and talked to the Tumlinson family. I'm not going to do the pseudo history, the pseudo science. I'm not going for all the BS, and I'm going to try to keep opinion and speculation completely removed from this. So just put it as it is, and you can decide what you want and all. That's just the best way to put it. Now, my first exposure to this was a book in 1983. A gentleman by the name of Robert Sikorsky. It was called Fool's Gold. Later, he releases the same exact book, and he called it Quest for the Dutchman's Gold. So either one of these books, this one I think you find the most often, but they're the same book. And there was a section in there on the Peralta stone maps. And I picked it up 83, 84 probably when it first came out, one of the first editions. Obviously the Fool's Gold was the first, and I have my copy, and it's a signed copy. And I found it interesting, the stone map thing. I think the first reaction I had to it is, why would someone make a map on stones and try to carry it around? That just seemed kind of awkward. Hadn't really heard of them before that. You got to remember my time spent in the mountains around. They were Dutch hunters going off the maps, the clues, Jacob Wald stuff. And I think there's also that disassociation at times a lot of Dutch hunters have with, there's nothing on them that really designates them concerning the Lost Dutchman Mine. The Peraltas had a lot of different mining areas and so forth and things. So I just don't think I was exposed to it in anyone that was, as Frank Augustine refers to them as, stoners. And so I wasn't part of all that. So that was my first exposure to it. He has, in the pictures in the book, there's things crossing out certain sections of the map and stuff. And, I was like, I never heard of those. And I think that was about it. And it wasn't until years later. Now, the other books to reference, obviously, this one's probably important because it's written by a gentleman named Travis Marlowe, who's not Travis Marlowe, but it's called Superstition Treasures, and this is simply about the discovery of the stone maps and so forth and all that, and a lot of the history of it. So that's that, Travis Marlowe, Superstition Treasures, which came out, I believe, in 1965 or 66. It followed the Life magazine articles, which I think we're probably around 65, so it might have been in 66. Another book that touches upon it, but he touched upon about it more in interviews. There's I have a couple different interviews by the gentleman with Tom Collenborn and with Greg Davis, a gentleman by the name of Robert Garman. And Bob Garman did write a book, Mystery Gold, the Superstitions. There's a little information in here on the stone maps. Not much. He ended up, and we'll talk about that, he had a relationship with Travis Tumlinson and the stone map and so forth. In his interviews, which one of them is an 8-part, It takes hours. It must be 4 or 5 hours of interview. But he talks quite a bit about his history with the Tumlinsons and so forth. The last book, it was actually in a book called The Golden Dream, Lost Dutchman Mine, Golden Dream by Thomas Glover. But he expanded on it in Treasure Tales of the Superstition Mountains. And so Thomas Glover, that book, he has an expanded section and covered a lot of different pieces of the history. So a lot of my refresher was off these books. I wasn't going to guys who have stone map books necessarily, where, well, I figured out the stone maps and here's my solution and all this. I was going forward to explain the history, because when we reference them, or we reference a Dutch hunter concerning them and this and that, that's what we're kind of working on. And I wanted a lot of stuff to pass through. Obviously, a lust for gold, race against time, and some stuff to pass through before I kind of went in and kind of touched upon this stuff and kind of tried to do, like I said, it won't be totally chronological, but it'll be a bit of a history. So to get started, it starts with a gentleman by the name of Travis Tumlinson. Now, you saw the book that I showed before that said Superstition Treasures by Travis Marlowe. Travis Marlowe is actually Clarence Mitchell. And this, so don't confuse the two, because Clarence Mitchell wrote the book about Superstition Treasures. It's about Travis Tumlinson and his discovery of the maps. In it, Travis Tumlinson is called Jack. Don't know why, which will make more sense to you later, but he refers to him in the book as Jack. Doesn't give dates, doesn't really kind of give you much of a timeline in the book, but we know some of the timelines of things. The family doesn't even, you would have thought there would have been like, oh, it happened, December 12th at this time in 1949. We know it was probably around 1949 when Travis Marlowe found the maps. It's claimed he discovered the maps. Now, he lived in Oregon. His family was in Texas. He was born in Pandora, Texas, I believe. So he was traveling to see family and traveling down the US 60 and just around the area of Florence Junction. He's traveling along and he decides, and according to the book, he wants to get out and see if there's a good view of Weaver's Needle. We also hear the alternative version of he was getting out just to relieve himself. Now, there's a gas station down the road, so you could go with either one. Who knows? Maybe he had to go. So he pulls over, he's walking out, and he walks some distance, and he's walking along, and he trips over this rock, and he looks down, and he sees like he can see something writing or something on the rock, and it looks just kind of odd. So he starts digging around it, digging it out. According to the book, he finds the priest horse stone. And this is the one that has the priest and stuff on one side and the horse on the other. It's kind of white grayish. And that's what he found. I'm going to say he found that, took it out, put it in the trunk of his car, took it to the filling station. There was a filling station down there at Florence Junction. And he went to the filling station and stopped there. And then he started to hose it off to see what was on it. And then a guy came out and said, looks like you found yourself a treasure map there, buddy. And then he threw it back in the trunk of the car, and then he proceeded on to Texas. This is kind of important, you'll notice later. So that's the story, verbatim there. He gets to Texas, shows the family, they kind of see it. His grandfather was a treasure hunter. His name was Pegleg Tumlinson. A lot of people have heard that term. And his uncle was a gentleman by the name of Robert Tumlinson, who was Pegleg's brother, okay? Who I believe lived in Oregon with Travis. Now, try to follow, because it does get confusing. Because remember, Clarence Mitchell is Travis Marlowe, and Travis Tumlinson in the book is Jack. They don't always use a lot of other names, but so now he goes back to Oregon. He has a stone map, and it takes him a while to figure it out. And according to that first earliest published version, he goes back because he figures it out. He goes to some petroglyphs, and then there he finds a cactus which has a hole in it, and it sights, and it takes him right back to the same hill he was on. So then he starts digging, and he digs up what are the two trail maps. One has the dawn on the one side, and the other one has the cross on it. And on the other side, they have the trail maps, and they're like kind of bookend there. And the heart. And he finds those and digs those up, and then puts those in the trunk of his car. And I guess there's some issue, is like he also claims he found one of the Temple of the Maps and then stayed the night there, and someone tried to get into his car and tried to jimmy the trunk, and he heard them and managed to scare them off and all this stuff. Very, very important here. Now, the earliest photographs we have, and I have a number of different photographs I've had from people, if it's a published work, if it's published out in a forum or somewhere, someone's documented research that's available, I will place it. But in the pictures we've seen, and the one that most people know is famous, is the picture of the automobile, the pickup truck that has them on the front bumper. And they've identified that the pickup truck, supposedly they were put on, and the pictures that were taken at the filling station are not done in Arizona. It was done in Texas. The picture emanated from Texas. And the other pictures I've seen are of the maps in Texas being displayed, which is kind of odd because you would have thought they would have either been Oregon or right there. I didn't expect them to have a camera, but I don't think anybody ever said, or on the photograph it said where it was done or anything like that. I think people just kind of probably made a story, which is opinion speculation, but like I said, it's at this point everyone knows the picture was taken in Texas, and I believe it probably was part of the family collection, and they knew it had the truck and so forth and all that. But in the story, he has a car because it repeatedly says he put it in the trunk. He drove his car here. He drove his car there. Someone tried to jimmy the trunk. He got back in the car. So I find it odd that they would have had that much mistaken. So that is the story of how he discovered them. Once he found the trail maps, he decided he needed to go in the mountains and find stuff. The earliest place they went to was Whiskey Springs, up in LaBarge, by the LaBarge box. And that's where they explored at first with the stone maps. And then somehow, within the next year or two, they ended up in Bob Garman found them down in Hewitt and Randolph Canyon. He found them going up and down in there, which is kind of a bit of a stretch away from there. So somehow they kind of placed down there, and Bob Garman became associated with them. I don't know if Bob Garman, I haven't listened to the tapes recently, and nowhere does it say the dates. And that was one of the tough things on this, is because the dates, there are some dates that are set solid, but some of these people that were associated with them come and go. And I don't know if Bob Garman was early or kind of later before Travis died. He did meet Travis. Him and Travis seemed to get along, but Travis was always suspicious of people. Garman, we know, helped fund them and kind of brought some money into it so they could make some trips into the mountains. He was always had to see a paper copy and the tracings of the map, which could have been with the Davis brothers later, and Robert Tumlinson. But he did talk about meeting Travis, and Travis not really having a great relation. What Robert Garman wanted to do is write a book on them. He wanted to use the maps. He wanted them to let him see and photograph the actual maps, which they didn't let him see. And he wanted to utilize those to actually kind of show it out there, and then using the book would help them raise funds for the treasure hunt to solve the maps and do all that. So that was Robert Garman, but between that, around 1950-51 or so, they kind of like Travis and Robert Tumlinson are doing these trips, and then something happens, and we're not sure, and there was an argument, but Robert Tumlinson claims that Travis wanted to sell the maps, and he seemed to be of a mind, maybe we just need to sell them to somebody and all this. And Robert, I guess, took possession of them at that time. And this resolves itself somewhere down later, but he takes on a gentleman, Dr. Gene Davis in Oregon, and his brother Ralph Davis, and they start searching. And they search for an indeterminate amount of time. And at one point, I believe around 1956, they even tried to get Northcutt Ely, Sims Ely's son, involved to fund them and help them with all this. And that seems to be a pattern that we catch at times, is they're trying to get people to support them, contribute, become partners with them, or sell the maps. It doesn't get spoken of in stone map circles very much that seemed to be an ongoing process. But it does seem to be the lexicon of all the people involved and what seems to be published from interviews and so forth. So we're going through and we get into the 1960s. In 1961, Travis Tumlinson passes away. Travis passes away, he must have ended up with ownership and possession of the maps again. Now, in between this, 1949 and 61, one point, the stone maps, Travis Tumlinson stone maps, they are put on display at a filling station or gas station in Texas, and they're there, and you can pay a nickel to go in and see them. So that was how he was raising some money for the trips. And a lot of people, what we've heard, is said those maps were smaller, and then the excuse was Travis carved those, which is kind of an odd thing, but they said they were smaller set, and they were carved to do that, significantly a bit smaller than the ones that are on display now. Now, I'd like to interject here the fact that when later they would end up in the Mineral Museum under the Flag Foundation, and now they're at the Superstition Mountain Museum on display. When I saw them at the Mineral Museum, Randy Wright and I both noticed a couple times we saw them when they were on display. They seemed to be different. It seemed like, I think they might have switched out the ones they had with the castings at times. I don't know the reason why. It just seems like after a while, they don't seem quite the same. They seem bigger, smaller, they seem to be different. The Life magazine ones seem rougher. It could be the photography of the time. If you see them in person, I've actually been able to take them and not only hold them and handle them, but bring them out in daylight and photograph them in daylight, high resolution. I have every single nick and cranny. I did a detailed, just kind of like over the whole maps and everything, and a lot of stuff that's on them to kind of detail around all the edges and every part of them. I was there with Jim Hatt. I know Mike McChesney was there, Greg Davis. There was a bunch of us there dealing with them, but we had them outside. And it was great because being able to do them in the shade, but then bring them in actual direct sunlight and work with them was amazing. But I've always noticed that I've seen photographs of ones that were different than this and this and this, which later researchers kind of explained to a bit and we'll get to. But I kind of noticed that is like, how come it seems like we're dealing with different maps at times? Now, the ones that are in Sikorsky's book are the ones that I definitely see at display at the museum. And then there are other replicas, and the replicas are easy to identify because there's only the one side, and you have, the way they're set up. But they're set up, and there's the Bilberry crosses and the Latin heart with those, and it was a set. And I think there was 12 to 15 of those, and I know most of the people that have those replica sets. So they were very limited edition, and I don't know when they were done, probably sometime in the 80s, maybe the 90s. But I know a number of the people that had them, and I've seen them and all. In fact, Jim Hatt donated his Bilberry crosses, and I'll touch that later, but he donated them for a raffle at the Dutch Hunter Rendezvous, which I won't mention the guy that unless he says it's okay. But a fellow Dutch hunter won those at that. So we have this discrepancy, but 1961 or so, Travis passes away. They've been on display, they've been this. Everybody seems to know about them. Let's just touch upon the fact that Bob Ward says he made them, and he also says he found them. Noble Dwyer says he found one in the crook of a tree, but it was embedded and he broke it trying to get out, but never pointed out the tree or the remaining piece, but then later dug around the bottom of the tree, and then after he got them, he ended up selling them to Travis Tumlinson. Never mind the 4th of July fireworks, okay? Happy 4th of July on the 5th. So then there was some guy, they said a Mexican, was digging post holes or fence pole holes somewhere, and he sold them to Bob Ward, who sold them to Travis Tumlinson. But he found them out near Pinal, which is where Bob Ward claimed he did. And then Charlie Miller had several stories. One, he went out with Travis after he found the Horse Priest map and found the trail maps. The other story was he went out with Travis and they found all the maps. And then the last one was he found the maps and sold them to Travis Tumlinson, which is kind of, he had the multi-layered. Then there was also, I'm trying to remember the gentleman's name, I think his last name was Steele, and he carved things and stuff, and supposedly he carved them, Johnny Steele, something like that. And then supposedly people said they saw him carving them, and he sold them to Travis Tumlinson for $75. All very interesting, 1961, 62, 63. Clarence Mitchell wants to come in, and he wants to grab this stuff. And Clarence Mitchell makes a deal with Aileen Tumlinson. And when he makes the deal with Aileen Tumlinson, she basically, the family has said this over and over, and it's published and it's been along, everybody's heard that. As he drove away, the kids all said she started yelling sucker at him when he paid her for the maps. Which makes us wonder, why did she say sucker? Well, which ones did he go with if there were more? And the story begins to unfold even more, because it's the stone maps and it's a rabbit hole and we keep digging around. And now Clarence Mitchell forms the MOEL, the Mole Company. Then this group goes out and he gets investors, and then he gets people, and they start selling stock. Well, as he's doing this to raise the stuff, he also gets Life magazine, and that's the first time they're really seen by the public, and it becomes the Life magazine article. All right, thanks so much for watching Chasing Legends. I know we're breaking things up in a couple parts here, but hey, stick with us for part 2 of the Peralta Stone Maps next week. I'm Wayne Tuttle. You're not. This is Chasing Legends. Take care. We'll see you next week.